Lisa from Been There, Got Out, and I'm hoping that the third time's the charm. Today's guest is a colleague of ours. She's part of the Amicable Divorce Network, and she's actually coming to us from across the pond. She's in the UK, and she has just written a book that we want to talk about that we're very excited to congratulate her on. And here she is, Chloe. I see you. Let me see if this. We're going to be talking about a few things, but I think Chloe in this book, I think she's here.
Ah,
Yay, it
hallelujah.
worked. Finally.
Nice to
Fantastic.
see you,
You
Lisa.
too. You too. And you're 5 hours ahead, right?
I
It's 5
am. It's
o'clock.
the end of the day here. You can probably see it's getting dark
Yeah,
slowly.
yeah, yeah. Wow, well, it's so good to see you, and
It's nice to see
congratulations
you.
on your new book. How
Thank
exciting.
you. It's a little bit like labor. It reminded me a bit of having
Oh
children.
my gosh. Labor was like the most painful ever. I think you can imagine. I wouldn't compare to that, but yes, like when it's done, like, it's done.
There's a
And you
relief
could just
for
relax.
sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, congratulations. Can you hold up a
Yes,
copy of the book?
I have it. I think it does a mirror image on Instagram, unfortunately.
Nice.
But the title is Don't Screw Up Your Divorce. And it's a yellow and pink cover.
Awesome. How did you come up with that title?
Oh, I wanted something that really showed people that they have a say in how their divorce goes down, that it isn't only something that happens to you, but that you can do things that will actually help direct things in the direction you want to be taking.
Yeah, like you have a lot of agency over this part because you're getting
Exactly.
out. Well, at least we hope
Exactly.
you're getting out.
Well,
Not
the
quickly.
book was written for the decision makers. So that's definitely the idea is, people who are at that kind of crossroads where they're just about deciding to divorce, but they don't know where to start. And usually at that stage, what I see in my practice is a lot of people come to see me and they're really worried. They think they're going to, do something wrong or take the wrong step and somehow create this massive conflict with their spouse. And it's a very vulnerable place to be. So I wanted to address those concerns head on and really help people take the time to get their ducks in a row, make sure they had everything in place to start things off on the right foot and hope for the best but also prepare for the worst.
Yeah, definitely. And as you're talking, so it's interesting because both you and I, work with people in the divorce process and we're not attorneys, but I think we each have our specialties and yours is very different from what we do. But what you're describing is what Chris and I call the babies. We always say no offense, but the ones who are really early in the process who haven't made any of those expensive mistakes yet.
Yeah,
And when you are a baby, we often say it's one of the most overwhelming
it is.
feelings because you're so early and you don't know what to do, but you have more power than you will ever
Yes,
have again, right?
absolutely. Especially if you're the one making the
Yeah.
decision, because you get to choose when you tell your spouse, how you tell your spouse. You get all the information gathered ahead of time and make sure that you're emotionally ready. So there's a lot of empowerment involved.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So before we get into it, Chloe, can you formally introduce yourself?
Yes. So I've been on your live before, but for those of you who don't know me, I am a certified divorce coach. I'm based in London, but I work internationally because my clients are mostly expats and international families. And I wrote this book for anybody, anywhere, whether they are having a local divorce or an international divorce, but I try to include elements throughout specifically targeted at internationals.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you because you have helped some of our clients in the past dealing with international issues. And it's so wonderful to have resources that we can refer people to because we don't, that's not what we know much about at all.
And same
So
on
we really
my
appreciate
side,
that.
because I don't usually deal with very high conflict divorces. A lot of my work is to help people who are trying to keep things as peaceful as possible. Sometimes their spouse plays games, sometimes they don't, but the intent is to try and keep things out of court. So it is a slightly different approach in that
Yeah.
scenario.
Yeah. So now in the book, you said that there's a lot that has to do with logistics and expectations. So tell us about that.
Yes. Yeah, because really in my mind, there's three kinds of preparation for anything big in life. There's the emotional preparation, there's the mindset and the expectations, and then there's the logistics. And I really tried to address all three of those in the book. Expectations is really the one that I tackled first because I think it's the one that leads to a lot of mistakes because people think they understand how divorce works. They've seen movies, all these ideas they have in their head. And it's trying to bring things back to reality and to make sure that they are choosing to get divorced because it's the right decision for them, not because they're hoping for example, a big moment of their spouse being told off by a judge because they did this or that.
Like in the
So I wanted
movie,
to address that. Exactly.
knock it out.
That big moment in court that everybody hopes for, where at last somebody's going to recognize that your spouse was wrong and you're going to get that emotional justice. I think that's one of the biggest errors I see people do and make, is because they think that they've been wronged and they expect the legal system to step up and recognize that.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, that's just not part of the process.
Right, right. Yeah. So now, the first thing that often we think about is like, how am I going to tell? For me, it was how am I going to tell my kids? But you
Yeah.
talk about how to tell your spouse. So
I talk
how do
about
you
all
do
of it,
that?
even how to even tell your friends and family, how to tell your employer, if you choose to do so. But telling your spouse is, of course, a very scary conversation. But with your children, it's even scarier because they're really kind of innocent victims in all of this.
Mhm.
And I don't think I've ever had a client who told me, "Oh, well, I don't care how my kids react." It's usually a very big concern. So I really wanted to spend some time addressing that and giving people some very practical tools on how to do it. And so I actually structured the chapter based on age groups and what type of questions and concerns you might see with children at different ages, what kind of questions they're likely to ask so that people can prepare some answers for those and not be caught off guard. And just that awareness of looking at things from the child's perspective and being aware of things that they might need in those moments to feel supported and to feel heard.
Yeah. I mean, how do you approach it differently with a 10-year-old versus a 14-year-old?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a very big difference, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of maturity, happening within those teenage years. So, with teenagers, they are actually at a time where they're starting to they're working on themselves and what matters to them. And so a lot of their questions might be very much about the impact on them.
Hmm.
And I think one of the things that people find most difficult when they're divorcing with teenagers is that oftentimes teens don't lean on their parents when they're not feeling well. And so they will potentially seek support from friends, from a boyfriend, a girlfriend, from a sports coach at school, a teacher. There's all sorts of people involved in their lives. And it's hard for parents to accept that sometimes they're not going to be the first point of call when the child is feeling uncomfortable, as having questions, etc. So that's definitely a very different approach to a 10-year-old who will likely just go back to mommy or daddy and ask their questions. And the questions they'll ask will be different, of course, as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember. I think it was a therapist that I was once interviewing, and they said something that was really surprising. And that's that, a lot of us feel like we have to stay in the marriage until the kids leave for
Mm,
college,
the
stay
classic.
for the sake of the kids. But that when you are getting divorced and your children have gone to college, it's actually one of the hardest times for kids that age.
Yeah.
Did you talk about
Yeah.
that in your book?
I actually have a part around grown up children, and that's a very big one because actually sometimes the kids have been out of the nest for a few years already by the time the parents decide to divorce. And so they haven't witnessed the tension or the problems, or the parents have been really good at hiding it. And
Hmm.
so for them, it could be a real bomb finding out that their parents are getting divorced because they didn't see it coming.
Hmm.
And actually, they're just at that age where they're starting to fly the
Right.
nest and build their own life and start their own serious relationships. And suddenly they're being kind of pulled back because they have to somehow be involved in this big event that's happening to their parents. Sometimes they feel they have to take care of their parents if one of the two is more upset or, is the one being left, for example. And so, in a lot of ways, it can kind of hinder their flight and their opportunity to take off. And people often think, oh, if they're already out of the household, it's not going to impact them. But that's absolutely not the case. It can be actually a much bigger impact sometimes than if they've seen the relationship deteriorate over time.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think about how their childhood and growing up with the parents together is their foundation.
It
And so
is.
just as they're flying the nest, they expect to come back. Like if they go back, they go away for college, they expect to come back for the holidays. and to come back where it's like, where do I go? Like,
Yeah.
whose home do I go to, or which, how do I choose between which parent I might be more loyal to? Is it okay to
Yeah.
love both of them? It's really, really tricky.
Yeah, and especially if they had this image of their parents' marriage as being a positive,
Hmm.
example for them to follow, and they're starting their own romantic relationships, and they had this idea, I want to be like my parents. They're this really solid couple,
Oh, yeah.
and suddenly that image kind of crumbles, and it can be really difficult for them to then reshape their own vision of what a good relationship looks like. And sometimes there's even resentment around, what you stuck it out all this time for me, but it wasn't for me. Now I have to live with the guilt that you lived
Right.
unhappily because of
There's a
me all this
lie.
time.
Like, you
Yeah,
lied to me,
yeah.
basically. So that's almost
It was a
like a level of
fallacy.
betrayal.
I can absolutely see how you would feel that way. So there's,
Yeah.
but nobody knows your children better than yourself,
Hmm.
and each parent is going to be particularly sensitive to what their children needs and what kind of reactions they've had in the past, what where they are, in terms of maturity. But being aware that every group, every age group has a, feels an impact and has a reaction, and not fooling yourself that because they're grown-ups or because they're tiny babies for that matter,
Hmm.
it's not going to impact them, because it will impact them. It's going to change the way they see their life and they see their parents.
Right. And I don't think you're saying that, it's going to be so awful, like that you should consider just staying together. It doesn't, that's not it at
Oh, no,
all.
absolutely not. No, absolutely
Yeah.
not. I think, it's inevitable that it has an impact on the children.
Right.
You can't, it'd be silly to say that children are come out completely unscathed of divorce, but all of the research has always shown that it isn't the divorce in itself that causes problems for the children, that hurts them, that creates trauma. It's the conflict that they witness, and that's
Yep.
whether their parents are married or not. It's that degree of tension and anxiety and the sense of being stuck between the two people they love most in the world. That's what's destructive to children.
Right. And even like you said, even if they didn't see conscious conflict, they still absorb that
They
energy, I
absolutely
think.
do.
Yeah.
They see the tension. They can tell even the little comments. Parents sometimes think that children don't notice the little passive aggressive comments or little puns. They noticed and
Hmm.
they can feel it. And I've had clients with children as young as 3 or 4 who've had their kids say, mommy doesn't love you anymore or daddy doesn't love you anymore. And that's
Hmm.
because they can perceive it. They
Yeah.
already can tell that there is no intimacy, there's no tenderness between their parents.
Yeah. Yeah. And staying and raising children in a situation like that basically kind of paves the way for them not to have healthy relationships, because we gravitate towards what's familiar.
Yeah. Exactly. It's just not a solution really, because you end up giving them this completely wrong role model, and then also it's just harmful for them to be growing up in that kind of environment. And we do see some children who have relief when their parents divorce. They actually feel that it's a weight off their shoulders because they don't have to live in that kind of environment anymore.
Yeah.
So all sorts of reactions really can come out of children depending on their history.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's excellent that you have prepared that section on how to approach it differently. Because people usually say, well, what do I say to my kids, without thinking that it really depends on where they are developmentally.
Yeah. And a big one that comes up is when you have lots of kids, or several kids, let's say,
Hmm.
and they're at very different ages. And I've had coaching sessions with clients who had children who were as young as 5 or 6, and then they'll have an older one who's in their early 20s, and it's not the
Mm.
same conversation at all. It's not the same impact. And then the conversations were, do they speak to them together, or do they address each of the children separately
That's
so
what I
that
was
they
just
can make
thinking
the
as you said that.
message?
Like,
Yeah,
and
but
they
because you
talk to
want the
each
message to
other.
be age appropriate,
Yeah.
you have to
Yeah.
definitely do it fairly close to each other, because you don't want one child knowing and the other one finding out 3 months later.
Right.
But so you'd want to, to make sure that they all know it fairly close to each other, but still it may be a very different conversation with a 20-year-old than it is with a 5-year-old. It will be a very
Mhm.
different conversation.
Yeah.
And if you speak to them together, you run the risk that the 20-year-old potentially takes over the conversation and the 5-year-old doesn't really get the space, or the other way around for that matter. And so
Hmm.
sometimes it does make sense to break it up if they're at very different levels of maturity and age.
Wow, interesting. All right. So I had mentioned at the beginning that we are both part of something called the Amicable Divorce Network.
Yeah.
And one of our goals is to try to keep you out of court,
Yeah.
and to be focused on your children. So you also talk about options in your book. Can you get into
Yeah,
that?
and that's something that I spend a lot of time doing with my clients, and that I realize a lot of people are not that informed about. A lot of people think that divorce has to go to court and it has to be a legal battle. And I wanted to make sure that people understand all the different sources of support available to help you achieve agreements. And it doesn't mean you have to be best friends and sing Kumbaya and go on holiday together.
Yeah.
It just means that you are trying to do this in the least painful way possible and usually the least expensive way possible.
Mhm.
So I wanted to make sure that people understand mediation, how it works, all the options. There's so much flexibility in mediation, but also options like collaborative law, like sharing a lawyer, which is allowed in some jurisdictions, all the arbitration, private hearings, all of those options so that they understand all the shades of gray and they know how to escalate. The error I see the most with clients is because they're afraid that they're going to be caught off on the back foot, they strike at the top. So
Mhm.
they really bring out the big guns. And it's very hard to backpedal from that and to de escalate once you've started at that level. And so I always recommend starting at the basic level, which is just speaking to each other directly and see what you can achieve that way. And then escalating little by little. Because it's just like the frog analogy, the frog in the boiling
Mhm.
water. If you throw it in, it's going to jump right out. And that's what's going to happen to your spouse if you throw them in the boiling water. Whereas if you're slowly escalating the heat, then you can hopefully achieve something and you can get to a solution at the right level for your situation. So I wanted to make sure that people have all that information up front so that they realize all the options that exist, really.
Yeah. And you know that Chris and I only deal with high conflict cases. And often when our client finds a lawyer like the pit bull type and they're like ready to go right to court and strike hard at the beginning, we say, you got to watch it because you know your ex and they're going to fight hard right back at you. So
Yeah,
it might not be the best thing to start like that. I understand that, you need someone to advocate strongly for you, but you have to think about the consequences knowing how your ex is.
that's
And a lot of
exactly right.
times when an animal gets cornered and attacked, they will fight back, uh,
Yeah.
with venom. And so that is expensive.
It's very expensive and it's very hard to backtrack.
Mhm.
So, part of the book is around how to tell your spouse. And there's kind of two components to that conversation. There's sharing the actual news that you want a divorce or you want to separate. And then there's that secondary conversation that needs to happen very quickly afterwards, trying to appease things and to encourage an amicable
Mhm.
resolution. And right from the start, telling the other person that you don't want things to escalate, that you want to keep things as peaceful as possible, getting them to understand the value in doing that. Some of the things we were just discussing, the stress, the cost, the time it takes to do it in a more litigious way, and to really make sure that you can guide them towards resources that are going to avoid them having misconceptions about what divorce could look like and bring them into the right expectations as well around how to approach their divorce rather than running to a pit bull if that's their first reflex.
Yeah, yeah. So speaking of that, money is always a huge issue. Like people often say, I can't leave because I can't afford it. I mean, I thought that. I was like, I
Yeah.
can't afford a $10,000 divorce, even though mine costs 10 times that, not including all the years after. But
Yeah.
how do people budget, especially let's say one person has not been earning an income for a long
Yeah.
time because they've been raising
And
children?
it can be really scary, right? I mean, you're
Yeah.
you're spending money you don't have
Hmm.
basically for a completely uncertain outcome. I've got a whole chapter in the book called Can I Afford to Divorce? And I
Hmm.
look at the two aspects. Can I afford the divorce itself? And then can I afford to be divorced
Yeah.
and to live on a single income? And both of them require some significant thought. But I don't think either one of them are something that you can't overcome and that would warrant you not making a decision that is the right
Hmm.
one. I think it's just about mitigating the risks and making sure that you're as prepared as possible. So, with regards to the cost of the divorce itself, one of the first things I do with any client is build a budget. What
Hmm.
kind of professionals do you think you're going to need based on where you are? What's your budget for each of them? Doesn't mean you're going to stick to the budget 100%. Plans are meant to be broken, right?
Well,
But
tell me
you have
about
an
it.
expectation and you can monitor against that.
Hmm.
So, part of the selection process in identifying the professionals you work with is not just how much they cost, but how often they're going to invoice you so that you can keep track of those expenses and pivot your strategy accordingly. If you've already spent 20 grand and you got nowhere, well, maybe you're going to start doing things a little bit differently, but you want to be monitoring that expense as it goes before you get to that point where you've spent, 100 grand.
Yeah, I mean, as you're describing that, that's something that we call taking strategic oversight of your case and realizing that you are the client and you are
Yes.
paying the bills. This is your money. So
Exactly.
you can't just be led by what other people say, like, unless you have to do it. Like, is it worth one day of mediation after you've tried 7 times and it's going to cost $4,500? Like,
Yeah.
you get to make that decision. It's
Yeah.
not just, well, someone said that this is the next step. Like, your case, your life after
Yeah.
a while, of course. Yeah, but budgeting and picking the right professional support is super important,
Yeah,
you
and
know?
that comes into play in selecting the people you work with. And again, there's a whole chapter on how to select the right professionals. And it's not just the right category of professional, it's the right person within that category. And realizing that you're a client. I have so many people who come to see me and they didn't interview their lawyer, they just took the first person they found on Google or that somebody recommended, and they don't realize that they're a client. Even if a lawyer is somebody that you perceive as someone with authority and a high level professional, you're still the one paying their fees.
Right.
And so you should be working with somebody that you feel comfortable with and that works with you in a way that works for you, so that answers your emails in a manner that works for you, that is as timely as you would expect, that invoices you and charges you in a way that you would expect. And people don't always think they have that decision power. They think that they have to just go along with whatever modus operandi the lawyer mentioned. But actually, we have a lot of power in those relationships because we're the ones
Right.
paying.
Right. And I know in our community, it's an intimate relationship with the lawyer because ours are the cases that go on for years and you're in court all the
Yes.
time. So there's a lot of communication. So it is really important to make sure that you have a rapport with this person and
Mm-hmm.
especially that you understand billing practices, because most of us don't realize that most lawyers bill every 6 minutes. So when you
Yes.
get on the phone with and I've made this mistake, certainly,
I did
and
too.
you're
I
having
did
like,
too.
what do I do? Your lawyer is not trained as a therapist, probably.
Yeah.
So there's
And
other
that's where there's
resources.
people like patients and really keep the conversations with the lawyers to the law and try and have those other conversations with other people who don't charge quite as much.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. What about like other things to look for in terms of professionals? Do you recommend certain types that everyone have? I mean, obviously a lawyer for a divorce process, but what other
Yeah.
people do you suggest people look for?
Well, I'm a big fan of using financial advisors, and there's all sorts of different financial support you can get, and it depends on your situation. But I do go through different sorts of financial support that you can seek out. Whether it's a pensions advisor, just a generic financial advisor, a mortgage broker who can help advise on your house and what you do with the family home, a tax advisor. In international divorce, taxes is a very big concern
Mm,
because it's not the same tax laws everywhere, and people think that they're offsetting property X in Germany for property X in Montana because they're valued at the same amount, but actually selling property X in Germany will cost you 50 grand of taxes, which it wouldn't cost you in Montana. So understanding the taxation is really, really important as well, and I think it's something people often overlook.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I certainly wouldn't have thought about that. Very important. What about the judgment of others? So we talked about
Mm.
telling your spouse, telling your kids. How do you tell other people? And I'm always thinking with the domestic violence cap on of like all these things
Inevitably.
happen and people want to know. Like, how do you
Inevitably,
deal with that?
right? They always want to know. People are going to ask why the minute you,
Mhm,
you 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 tell them you're getting a divorce. And what I always tell my clients is everybody needs to come up with their own narrative.
mhm.
So your ex is going to build their own story, and that's fine. That's their story. It doesn't have to be your truth. You're going to have to come up with a narrative because you're going to get asked so many times. You're going to end up realizing that whether you try to or not, you're telling the same story over and over again. But the main thing I wanted to address is boundaries, because people can be a bit nosy, curious, or even try to be helpful, but actually be inappropriate in the comments they make. And so I wanted to really, once again, empower people to be very clear on their expectations from their friends and family around what they want from them. Do they need their advice, or do they actually only need them to be there for them, or to go out with and have fun with, or whatever their role is in that time in their life, but also to know how to push back on inappropriate intrusions. And I share some specific sentences that can be used in different scenarios to push someone gently away and say,
Mhm.
no, this is now beyond my boundary, and I'm not engaging in this conversation. So, whether it's saying bad things about your spouse, whether they're true or not, maybe you don't need to hear that. And knowing how to push back on that, or whether they're just sharing gossip that they've heard about, either your spouse or yourself. All of those things are things that people do, oftentimes not in a very ill-intended way,
Mhm.
but that can be really a poisonous energy in your life when you're already going through so much turmoil. And knowing what's acceptable to you, what's not, and communicating those boundaries is really important.
Yeah, I'm thinking, so you're talking about other people asking. We often see our clients who say, I want to tell everybody. Like
Oh, I
I
see
want to
that as
tell
well.
people, just like with the day in court, like I want people to understand how bad my ex is.
Yeah.
What are your
And
thoughts on
I think it's
that?
about choosing the people. It's completely natural, right, to want to get it out. It's who do you need to do it with, and who do you choose to do it with? Who is it safe to do it with? But I also mentioned in the book, a technique that I've used myself, which is to write a letter, or to even do a fictional trial. Sit yourself in front of a mirror. Imagine you're getting your day in
Mhm.
court, and you can finally tell a jury all the horrible things your spouse did, and get it out, spill it out, just let it come out of your system in an environment that's safe and where it's not going to backlash. Because ultimately, if your objective is to separate yourself from this person, telling them all these things is only going to make matters worse, and it's going to make the process longer and more painful. So it's against your own good, your own well-being, really, to go ahead and tell them, but you can get it out in other ways that are safe and controlled.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is so important to get it out. And sometimes people will be like, I shouldn't feel this way, or I should behave better. And I'm like, you have to get it out, but you
Yeah,
got to get it out to the right outlet, not to
exactly.
your ex for sure. And because that's going to end up harming you in a number of ways. We do something with our clients called free check-ins through email.
Yeah.
And we have a whole collection of letters never to be sent. And many of them are absolutely hysterical.
Yes, I can
So
imagine.
funny.
It
Yeah,
feels good to get it
it
out, right?
does.
The other
It
thing
does.
is, I
You
see
have
people
to
wanting
get
to
it
tell
out.
their kids. Sometimes people want to tell the children to get their support, because they feel that they want the kids to kind of, I guess, align with them, or to at least empathize with their predicament. And again, that's, a very big mistake, because even though it gives you that relief, you're harming your children. And so it's, again, looking for another way that you can get that relief, but without creating the damage that it would otherwise.
Yeah, definitely, because that's a whole other thing with your kids, taking care of your emotional needs, unhealthy. Yeah,
Yeah, it's hard. It's a difficult time.
it really is. So Chloe, any other last things we should know about your book, like how to find it or how to find you?
Yes. Well, so the book is available worldwide on Amazon. It's on Kindle for those who want to read it discreetly, and on paperback. And you can find me. You'll see all my contact details are in the book, and I actually have a 20% voucher in the book as well off my services. So for those of you who read the book, who find it helpful, and who then want to have a personalized approach to how they prepare, that's a really good discount for them to tap into. In terms of reaching me, my website is thedivorceandseparationcoach.com. And there's a lot of free information on my website. So I encourage people to check it out, if only just to watch a few podcasts and videos or read a few articles, because they'll find a wealth of information, and it'll give them an idea of my philosophy, my approach, and how I work with people, but also give them some practical information on how they can tackle different challenges during divorce.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And thank you again for being such a fantastic resource for us as well.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Good luck with the book.
Take care, Lisa.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.